Okay, let's talk about fear. Not just, the jump scares,
Right.
but that really deep psychological kind. The sort of fear that can, well, build a prison stronger than any actual lock and key.
It's pretty terrifying to think about, yeah. How someone could be held captive for, years.
Even when it seems like maybe, just maybe, they could have escaped physically.
It really just shows the sheer power of psychological manipulation. It can be just as binding as chains, sometimes even more so.
Exactly, and that's what we're getting into today. The story of Colleen Stan. It's a case that was actually described in court as unparalleled in FBI history.
Unparalleled, yeah. She's often known, sadly, as the girl in the box.
And for this deep dive, we're mainly drawing on a pretty detailed Wikipedia article. It lays out the whole sequence of events, her kidnapping, the years she was held.
Our goal here isn't just to run through the timeline, though it's obviously shocking.
No, we want to unpack the disturbing details, sure, but also really try to get a handle on the psychological factors, the really chilling stuff, and what happened after she finally got away.
Basically, pull out the most important knowledge nuggets from the source material for you, the listener.
And that fact you mentioned earlier, unparalleled in FBI history, that really sets the stage. This wasn't typical.
Not at all. It was way more complex and horrifying. So where does it start?
Okay, May 19th, 1977. Colleen Stan is 20 years old. She's hitchhiking from Oregon down to California, going to a friend's birthday party.
And she wasn't totally inexperienced with hitchhiking, right? She was being careful.
Yeah, the source says she actually turned down a couple of other rides first, but then Cameron Hooker pulls up in this blue van.
And the thing that made her feel okay about it, the detail that lowered her guard.
His wife, Janice, was in the passenger seat.
Yep.
And they had a baby with him. It looked, safe, like a family.
Which just makes what happened next even harder to stomach.
Totally. They stop at a gas station. Colleen goes to the restroom, and she said later she had this really intense feeling, like a voice screaming at her inside, "Run! Get out! Jump out the window!"
Wow. That intuition.
But she ignored it, told herself she was being paranoid,
God, that's haunting, knowing what came next. Because it wasn't long after that, maybe 20 minutes down the road.
He pulls off the highway, says he wants to look at some caves nearby, just explore a bit.
And that's the moment.
That's it. Janice gets out with the baby, walks off towards a lake, and while they're gone, Cameron attacks Colleen in the back of the van.
With a knife.
Knife to her throat, yep. Ties her up, and then he puts this wooden box over her head.
The source calls it a head box. Specifically designed, it says, to block out everything light, sound, even air.
Just complete sensory deprivation, instantly isolated.
And the context here is, well, even darker. Apparently, Cameron and Janice already had this agreement to capture a slave.
For his fantasies, yeah. And initially, there was this supposed rule about no penetrative sex.
Which, as we learned pretty quickly, didn't last. That rule went out the window.
The very first night was just horrific. The source describes her being strung up by her hands, attacked, left blindfolded, hanging there.
While the hookers had sex nearby her, below her even.
Yeah, and her daily life just became this cycle of torture. Kept locked in a box, sometimes a different one, but mostly locked up for 23 hours a day.
23 hours. And then in January 78, she was forced to sign this so-called slavery contract, basically signing her life over to him.
And the psychological terror was just constant. There's this one detail about a photo of Marie Elizabeth Spanhag.
Another young woman who disappeared. A previous victim, though her body was never found.
Right. And he propped her photo up under the bed where Colleen could see it from inside the box.
It's just pure psychological warfare. He wasn't just locking her up physically, he was building this mental cage.
But this whole story about the company.
Exactly. This powerful, shadowy organization he claimed was watching her every move, watching her family too.
And the threat was that if she ever tried to escape or tell anyone,
the company would torture her horribly and go after her family. That fear, that was the real lock on her cage.
her whole identity was just stripped away. She wasn't Colleen anymore. She was Kay.
Had to call him master. Couldn't even speak without permission.
And the sexual abuse was constant, tied into his specific twisted fantasies, like wanting her to act out scenes from that book, Story of O.
Yeah. And he started with oral rape, supposedly to, stick to that initial no penetration deal with Janice.
But that didn't hold.
Yeah.
He quickly moved on to using objects for vaginal and anal rape, getting around the rule.
It's just layer upon layer of horror. Then they moved to a mobile home in Red Bluff. But the confinement didn't stop.
Still kept in wooden boxes, hidden away under their waterbed.
And this detail is just staggering. Janice actually gave birth to their second child
On the waterbed.
on that waterbed while Colleen was trapped in a box directly underneath her. That was in 1978.
How does anyone even survive that?
Yeah.
Mentally, physically?
The source mentions her faith played a role. Faith in God and this sort of stubborn inner belief that maybe someday she'd get a chance to escape.
But that hope must have been constantly crushed by the fear. That fear of the company. Cameron kept hammering that home, day after day.
Absolutely. But interestingly, her compliance, doing everything he said to avoid pain, eventually led to him loosening the physical chains, so to speak.
Right, after years of almost total confinement, she was allowed out more.
Slowly at first. Jogging, doing yard work, then helping with the kids.
And then, almost unbelievably, she was actually helping him build more places to hold captives, like an underground dungeon.
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around.
Which brings us back to that huge question. Why didn't she run? When she had these moments of, relative freedom, access to phones, neighbors nearby.
The source is clear on this. It was the fear. The fear of the company was so deeply rooted, so overwhelming, it just paralyzed her.
The psychological prison was stronger than any open door.
It completely short-circuited any rational thought of escape. And maybe the most stark example of this is in 1981. Cameron let her visit her family.
By herself.
By herself. She went home, saw her parents, her family.
And she didn't say a word about what was happening.
Not a word. The fear of what Cameron or the company would do was still just too immense.
How did her family react? They must have known something was wrong.
Oh, they were deeply worried. She looked different, was wearing these strange homemade clothes, had no money. They hadn't heard from her in years.
What did they think was going on?
They suspected maybe she was in a cult. That seemed like the only explanation. But they were also afraid to push too hard, afraid she'd just disappear again completely.
God, what a terrible position for them, too. And then the next day.
She goes back for another visit, but this time Cameron comes along, posing as her boyfriend.
And there's that photo from the trial
Yeah.
of them smiling together.
Yeah. Knowing the reality behind that smile, it's just chilling. It shows how total his control seemed, even in front of her own family.
But Stan apparently said later that those visits made Cameron paranoid.
He felt he'd given her too much freedom, yeah. Got scared she might break free.
So the consequence was horrific, back in the box.
For the next 3 years. From 1981 to 1984. Back under the waterbed, 23 hours a day.
3 more years like that,
Mhm.
after having a tiny taste of the outside.
It's almost unimaginable. The source describes her existence, using a bedpan near her feet, eating scraps. He told the kids Kay had gone home.
But he was still taking her out at night.
At night, yeah, when the kids were asleep. For abuse and to feed her just enough to keep her alive.
It's just beyond comprehension. But then, in 1983, things started to shift again. Slightly.
Yeah, slowly. She was reintroduced to the children, the neighbors. Eventually, she was even allowed to get a job as a maid at a local motel.
Okay, so a bit more interaction with the outside world again.
And this period, the slight increase in, let's say, normalcy, paradoxically led to the big turning point.
How so?
Cameron decided he wanted Colleen to become his second wife.
His second wife,
Yeah.
while still married to Janice.
And that was apparently the thing that finally broke Janice.
Janice's role in all this is so complicated. The source says she was also being abused by him, right? From the start.
Yeah, she confessed later that he'd tortured and brainwashed her too. Called her names, controlled her, right from their first date.
So her way of coping was, what? Denial.
Seems like it. Denial, compartmentalizing, just trying to survive day by day, maybe. But him wanting another wife, living in the house, that seemed to shatter her ability to keep doing that.
So by August 1984, she's really struggling.
Immensely. And there's this conversation described between her and Colleen. Janice finally tells her, look, Cameron isn't part of the company.
Okay, that's huge.
It is. But interestingly, Janice apparently still insisted that the company itself was real, just that Cameron wasn't actually in it.
Weird detail. But even that partial truth must have been enough.
It was enough to crack the foundation of his control. Colleen realized he wasn't this all-powerful figure connected to some vast, terrifying network.
So what did she do?
She went to a bus station, called Cameron, told him she was leaving. He apparently cried on the phone.
He cried? Wow.
And then she just got on a bus and went home after 7 years.
Finally free. But she didn't go to the police right away.
No, which is fascinating. For months, she actually kept calling Cameron regularly.
Why? After everything.
She said at the trial it was because Janice asked her to. Janice still held out some hope, apparently, that he might change, might reform somehow if Colleen stayed in touch.
That's hard to understand from the outside.
Airy. It wasn't until 3 months later, November 1984, that Janice herself walked into a police station.
And reported Cameron?
And reported everything. That's when the case finally broke wide open.
Yeah, and Janice's testimony. It was obviously critical. But it came with another huge shock.
Yeah, in exchange for full immunity from prosecution.
Full immunity, okay.
She confessed that Cameron had kidnapped and murdered Marie Elizabeth Spanhack back in 1976, before he even abducted Colleen.
Oh my God, she knew about that the whole time.
Apparently so. And she gave the police horrifying details. How he picked Marie up, took her to their basement, hung her up, tortured her for a day.
Whole day.
Shot her with a pellet gun, strangled her, and then buried her body in a shallow grave up near Lassen Volcanic National Park.
Just laid it all out.
Laid it all out. But, and this is a crucial point in the source, despite her detailed story, they never found Marie Spanhack's remains.
So no physical proof.
No physical proof. And because of that, Cameron was never actually charged with Marie's murder.
But the testimony must have been devastating anyway in the trial for Colleen's kidnapping.
Absolutely. The trial was in 1985. You had Janice testifying against him under that immunity deal. You also had expert testimony from a forensic psychologist, Chris Hatcher, explaining the extreme psychological control.
And the verdict?
Guilty. Guilty of the sexual assaults, the kidnapping, using the knife. He got a very long sentence, 104 consecutive years.
104 years, so effectively life. What's his status now? The source mentions parole.
Right. His parole eligibility has been complicated. Originally, it wasn't until 2023. Then it got moved up somehow to 2015, but he was denied parole then.
Great.
Next eligibility was supposed to be 2030, but there was a big development in 2021. He was evaluated and designated a sexually violent predator.
And what does that mean for his release?
It meant he was released on parole, but not into the general public. He was transferred to the custody of the Department of State hospitals. So, still confined, but in a different setting.
Got it. That's a really important distinction. What about Colleen Stan? How do you even begin to rebuild a life after that?
It's hard to imagine. The source says she studied accounting, tried to live a, quote, normal life. But it also notes that, understandably, the trauma had lasting effects. It mentions misery followed her, failed marriages, difficulties with a child.
That's heartbreaking. That's surprising. Did she find any way forward?
It seems she did find some purpose. She volunteered at a women's refuge center, helping other abuse survivors. She changed her last name for privacy. And according to the source, she still lives in California.
And Janice. What happened to her after testifying?
She went back to her maiden name, Lashley, and she actually became a registered associate social worker, a mental health professional.
Wow. That's quite a path.
Yeah. She also still lives in California, like Colleen.
This whole case is just so extreme. The duration, the conditions, the psychological manipulation. It's no wonder it's stuck in the public consciousness.
Definitely. It taps into some really deep fears about vulnerability, control, loss of self. You see its fingerprints all over popular culture.
Like in films.
Yeah, there's the Poughkeepsie tapes, which has elements, and then the more direct adaptations, the Girl in the Box movie and a documentary with the same name.
In books too, right? I think Perfect Victim was a big one.
That's probably the most famous one. And Colleen Stan wrote one too, The Simple Gifts of Life.
Music as well. The source listed a few.
Yeah. Blake Babies have a song called Girl in a Box. There was speculation about a whole song being inspired by it. Illusion Fields has one called Jack in the Box. Even an experimental noise group named after the case.
And I guess TV crime shows must have mined this territory quite a bit.
Oh, constantly. Shows like Criminal Minds, Law and Order, SVU, Unsolved Mysteries. Lots of them have used elements. The whole idea of psychological control, the fake organization, the long confinement in a small space, it keeps popping up.
It really shows how much the sheer psychological terror of it resonates. That level of control is just horrifying to contemplate.
Absolutely.
So that brings us through this deep dive into the Colleen Stan case. We've covered the kidnapping, the years of imprisonment, Janice's really complex role, the escape, the trial, and what happened afterwards.
It's an incredibly disturbing story, but it also, I think, highlights Colleen Stan's unbelievable resilience, the strength it must have taken just to survive.
For sure. And it forces you to confront the really dark potential of the human mind both for the perpetrator's manipulation and the survivor's endurance.
Yeah, the depths of psychological control are just staggering.
Right. And maybe, as we finish up here, a final thought for you, the listener, drawing from this source material. Think about that power of psychological manipulation. How something like the company, a threat that wasn't even real in the way Cameron portrayed it.
Yeah, basically a fiction he created.
How could that perceived threat build a prison more effective, more inescapable for years than any actual physical wall or lock?
Yeah.
It's a chilling question, but it feels central to understanding the awful reality of what happened here.